This is GARIS, masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 462, entitled, "Is Masculism Hate Speech?" Description. This flyer agrees that masculism is hate speech and claims that masculist hate speech is fully justified, since what the masculists are hate speeching against deserves to be hated, particularly the decades-long man-slaving parasitism of fluffies and the hated hypocrisy of fluffy feminists in the divorce courts, who ruin the lives of one father in 4. These massive gender crimes by fluffies and fluffy feminists deserve to be hate-speeched against. Feminists do this to men for the ways that men oppress women, so men deserve the same right to hate-speech women who oppress men, who in fact oppress men far worse, since even rape is small beer in comparison with the decades-lasting man-slaving parasitism of fluffies, who don't bother to fip up and just expect to live off the money and labour of a man for the rest of her life. Hopefully, in a few decades, as masculist ideas spread across the planet, most people will agree with the masculists and accept the validity and desirability of masculist hate speech, the way they do today, with hate speech against the idea of negro slavery. Now the flyer itself. Is Masculism Hate Speech? By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Is masculism hate speech? Of course it is, because masculism is essentially abolitionism, an attack against slavery. That is man-slavery, that is fluffydom, that is women who don't bother to fip up, that is they don't become economically competent, then expect to live off the money and labour of a man for decades. Such women are manslavers by definition. The man works for her and does not get paid by her, so satisfies the very definition of slavery, that is unpaid work. A century ago, such women had a good excuse for living off the money and labour of a man. That is, she had a dozen kids to look after, which was a full-time job. So if a man wanted his kids to survive within the context of the nuclear family, he needed his wife/mother to look after his kids. And she, the mother, could not look after his and her kids if she starved to death. So she depended on his money that he earned outside the home to buy food for the family. But now we live in the era of the pill, of science-based medicine, of women having life expectancies well into the 80s and having 0, 1 or 2 kids, so have a career window of half a century, so have a very powerful moral obligation to fip up, that is become FIPs, that's financially independent persons. Since even if she takes 6 years off work to raise small children, until the second one is off to kindergarten, she still has a career window of half a century. So if she does not bother to fip up by getting a career competent education that allows her to be financially responsible FIP as an adult, then by the masculist definition, she is a manslaver, living off his money and labour for decades, which is a major and hateable gender crime, according to the masculists. The pill, the contraceptive pill, has only been with us for about half a century, so its enormous social and political consequences are still working themselves out in the great flow of history. The pill effectively allowed the rise of the feminist movement, since women had reliable control of the number of kids they wanted, and they wanted only a small number. So upper middle class women in the 60s found they had time on their hands when their few kids were off to school, So these women got bored being housewives, feeling their lives and their considerable talents were being wasted. So they rebelled and formed a second wave feminist movement, which was largely about women's careers. For example, equal pay for equal work, equal access to the professions, plus other landmark changes they produced in society, such as fault-free divorce and the abortion right. Millions of women then streamed into the workforce, earning good money in some cases for those women who did bother to fip up, studying majors that the economy valued. A half-century later, it is now the turn of the masculists, of men, to liberate themselves from female financial parasitism, living for decades off the labour and money of a man. The masculists are saying, quote, "Now that women can work, they must work, since anything else is manslavery, and to masculists, manslavery is slavery and is hence hated." Masculists, by their nature, lash out at manslavery, using very hateful speech for the obvious reason that manslavery is to be hated because it is slavery. Masculists make a close historical analogy between today's masculist fight for the fipping of women, that is, masculists' main political and social goal of creating a FIP society in which all children of both sexes, and especially girls, are socialised and educated by parents and teachers to FIP up, and are threatened and scared that if they don't, then they will pay a horrible price when these girls grow up of not getting a man. So they will really suffer by not getting any love, no sex, no baby, and will be spat at for being a fluffy, man-slaving parasite, and hence rejected from society for being a hated, immoral, parasitic, bloody fluffy. Masculists deliberately use hate speech as their main tactic to scare women to fip up or deserve to be hated, because in the modern world, slavery of any kind is to be hated. In today's world, nearly 100% of people living in first world countries would agree that slavery of Negroes is something to be despised, to be hated. Masculists are currently out to educate the planet that fluffydom is manslavery and that manslavery is slavery, since it is no longer needed. Quote, "Women have a half-century career window, so have to fip up or be punished by men by not getting one." End quote. The above sentence is now pretty much the mantra of the masculists. It expresses very succinctly the core idea of the masculists. Humanity is currently very much in a major historical gender political transition phase, in which the traditional gender roles are switching from the old mother as housewife and child raiser role and father as sole breadwinner role to a new gender role that is largely the same for both sexes, that is, as careerists, since women now have a half century to be careerists, even those women who have 2 kids. Of course, there is a certain asymmetry in the 2 sexes, since it is only the women who grow the babies and breastfeeds them. So for a few years of the new gender norms, these basic realities need to be accepted. So the masculists are pushing for women to accept the masculist, in quotes, women's mother career timeline, that's MCT, where the upper middle class woman gets her master's degree at 23, works in her career for 5 years, having gotten married by then, has her first kid at 29 and second kid at 31, in brackets, so as not to crash the birth rate and hence help wipe out whole populations, close bracket, receives a maternity wage from the government for the 6 years she is at home, raising her small children. Then at 35, once her second kid is off to kindergarten, she goes back to her career and works for up to half a century. brackets, since the retirement age will need to be continuously raised as the number of children born continues to decrease until the government men-fares the gender laws. For example, reforms the divorce courts, legislates the that's paternity rejection right, creates gender equality committees in parliaments that address feminist and masculist issues equally, etc. Close brackets. All this is still in the future for the masculists, showing how much work is still to be done. We are not there yet. So the masculists have to change things. And lots of people don't like being changed. For example, look at the fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts. They like their privileges that these courts give to fluffy women who end up with custody of the kids with 90% probability. The husband's house, half his wealth, half his stuff, his child payments, and often alimony from him for the rest of his life. Of course, fluffies love this and don't want it changed, since they would then obviously benefit from divorce far less. Thus, the fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts are the natural enemy of the masculists. So not surprisingly, masculists hate them, because the fluffy feminists are destroying the lives of a quarter of fathers. Masculists employ hate speech against them for the obvious and simple reason that the masculists hate them. Such women deserve to be hated because they are manslavers, parasites, vermin, to be wiped out in the eyes of the masculists. Personally, I see the current anti-hate speech efforts of many video platforms as middle-class mindlessness, coming largely from middle-class, high school teacher level IQ'd women who care more about feelings than facts, about how it feels to be insulted rather than having the strength of intellect to stand back abstractly and try to listen to the content of the insult. Women have weaker abilities than men to do this, partly because women are simply dumber than men on average, with an average IQ about 4 points lower than men's average IQ, and have 10% smaller brains, that is 10 billion fewer neurons. So 10% lower neural processing capacity than men. So not surprisingly, the elite males are constantly complaining at the relative inability of women to be able to abstract and see the bigger picture the way the elite males do, better. Since women have female brains, of necessity, they will never be able to see the world the way the elite males see the world, since to be able to do that would require an elite male brain that women don't have, brackets, in nearly all cases. Personally, I find the critique coming largely from women against hate speech is rather stupid, since it seems obvious to me that, quote, some things should be hated. For example, take an obvious case. Imagine your entire immediate family is murdered by some criminal and you are the sole survivor. You would have every right to hate the criminal who did this, and nearly everyone would agree with you. If you were a Palestinian, you would hate the Jews for stealing your land. If you were Chinese, you would hate the Japs for invading China and killing tens of millions of Chinese, etc. In short, there are lots of good, valid reasons to hate certain things or to hate certain groups of people. Criticizing people who express hateful opinions about certain things or against social groups is not necessarily appropriate. Perhaps some things or groups of people should be hated and hence be attacked with hate speech. Of course, if you're a Zionist Jew or a Jap, you're not going to agree with the above examples, since it is you who's being hate speeched. So you will object and perhaps agree with the idea of a legal ban on hate speech. But what happens if, say, the Chinese invade Japan in the near future and get their revenge on the Japs for what the Japs did to the Chinese in the 30s and 40s? Then as Jabs, you would want to be free to express your hatred of the Chinese for their mass murders committed in Japan by their invasion of Japan. So you would then want freedom of speech to be able to vent your hatred of what is being done to you. A similar logic applies to the masculists, who are expressing hate speech towards their enemies, whom the masculists are aiming to wipe out, namely the fluffy manslavers and the fluffy feminist hypocrites, in brackets, who behave as feminists in the parliaments, but as fluffy parasites in the divorce courts, close brackets. Masculists feel they have very good reason to employ hate speech against their enemies, the fluffy manslavers, the fluffy feminist hypocrites, and the profoundly monoconscious feminazi bitches, who feel entirely free to use hate speech against men, whom they despise for all the ways that men oppress women. For example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, prejudice against women in the workforce, etc. The masculists claim that what is good for the goose is good for the gander. So these monoconscious feminists, in brackets, who know nothing of masculinist ideas, who see gender oppression as a one-way street, with women the oppressed and men the oppressors, close brackets, are hypocritical when they attack the masculists, when the masculists lash out at how women oppress men, and in the eyes of the masculists, far worse than vice versa, since the masculists, even rape is small beer in comparison to women's, that is fluffies, decades-lasting man's slavery of men, living off a man's money and labour for decades, and making no effort to get off her fat parasitic ass and fip up. So, when I hear women, particularly monoconscious feminists, attack masculist hate speech against fluffies and fluffy feminists, I see these women as hypocrites. They feel free to employ hate speech against men, and I can see their logic, that is, their reasons for feeling hateful against men who rape women, sexually harass women, beat